Welcome back to the show. Dana and I are just starting off.
We didn't start laughing though. That's a first.
No, but the start for us has been a little bumpy.
It has, but we haven't seen each other in a month, and we're catching up at a fast.
Yeah, we've got a lot to
info-dumping
talk about.
pace. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Dana forgot her Diet Coke twice downstairs, and then I went, and then all of a sudden she disappeared.
Yeah, because I was closing tabs indiscriminately and then just disconnected from our session. Yeah. My wife and I have the saying, we say, don't let me wander off. That's sort of like the saying when you're having one of those days.
It reminds me of like a little child that,
Yeah,
it's like a toddler, they're like maximum curiosity, minimum judgment,
yeah.
I'm wandering off and like, don't
I
don't
hope
let
my
me
name
wander
is,
off.
I hope my name is sewn in my sweater. So if I wander off something.
Better that than your underwear.
Please return to.
So Dana and I mean, we've got a lot to talk about. I mean, just so much to talk about. But, we really wanted to have this continuing conversation on neurodivergence because this idea of neurodivergence is growing, right? Like the awareness is growing. So when we talk about neurodiversity, that's a movement, right? It's this movement that kind of promotes this idea that neurological variance is not only expected but normal.
Yeah.
And so that, I mean, I'm probably oversimplifying, but the way that my little brain understands it is neurodiversity is the movement, right?
Yeah.
And then when we get into the people, we're talking about neurodiverse people, which would be the title of a group of people.
Yep.
And a neurodivergent person is the individual person.
Yeah.
And I think what we're finding, it took me a long time to learn that, by the way.
I know it did me. So I'm glad
Nick Walker really helped me with that one. Thank you, Nick Walker, for that. Big shout out. But the idea of neurodivergence is that there is a neurological variance, and you can be neurodivergent and not autistic, right? You can be neurodivergent and dyslexic, or have OCD, or have ADHD. Or anxiety,
complex trauma.
Yep. Right. So
Tourette's.
Yep. So we're really, I think when we start to understand, like, I think what's really cool about this, because Dana and I often question where I am in the matrix of neurodivergence, right?
Yeah.
I've now changed our description to, a neurodivergent psychologist pairs up with, and I put mostly neurotypical psychologist. And I, we've talked about, like, I don't believe that I've struggled enough to
the imposter thing.
The imposter thing, even though I swear I have overcome, or I have compensated for a writing disorder, but whatever, we talk about that. But so this idea of being neurodiverse or being neurodivergent is just that there is neurological variance from the neuromajority.
Yeah. And that label, I think, as I talk to people and in my own exploration, right, you sort of start out with a definition, and it's hard to learn something when it's not discrete. And so it's like this small version of it. And then as you learn more about it, you're like, oh, there's all these other layers to this. It could be this, and all these other things. And I'm sort of ashamed to say this. I'm being silly, not like truly shaming myself. But how different even autism is written in the ICD than it is in the DSM. We talk a lot about the DSM on the show. Yeah. I like the way it's written in the ICD better, because they talk about contextual variables, and they really go into a lot more about how the spectrum can really be large, right? And so if we even, and that's just the definition of autism. If we go to the definition of being neurodivergent, it does mean, you look at that word, right? Divergent, like you said, if you have a bell curve, I teach statistics, so I can't resist it. Sorry, bear with me. The bell curve just means the majority of people are under the big part of the bell. And then in those little corners are like the folks that there's not as many in the tails, whether it's on one side or the other. And so neurodivergence, you could say, is in those tails, right? So
Yeah.
we call it divergent just because it's not in the, like you said, the neuromajority. Now, neuro, of course, meaning neuro, right? Meaning neurological. I'm thinking back to even when I was in grad school, now, actually in grad school more than 25 years ago, which is sort of freaking me out. But I remember learning about things like Tourette's and tics and those kinds of, and even autism for that matter, ADHD. There was very much like this is a person who doesn't have enough willpower. They're succumbing to their impulses, right? It's just the stuff that's coming out and they're not controlling it. And the therapy has to be about sort of systematically desensitizing them from doing those things. And as someone who was an undiagnosed neurodivergent at the time, and I'd be sitting there like, oh yeah, so the times I've gone on vacation with my mom and she's noticed and criticized me for the fact that I eat my shredded wheat exactly the same way every morning. And I'm like, so there's something wrong with me, right? I need to stop doing this. She called me rigid. And I'm like, now I know it was just yet another sign of autism that I didn't realize was there. But that sense of like, how your brain works. And then you bring up a really important point, and that is, it's not just how your brain works in terms of the neurodivergence, but it's also, there's patterns that we tend to share in how we cope, right? Yeah. So we were talking before we went on the air about someone and a comment and some issues around eating. And it's so typical for people to want to keep their food separate or eat in certain order. I do this thing in my stats class every year. We run a chi-square based on the color of M&Ms. So I bring bags of M&Ms for them to play with because you never outgrow that, even if you're a grad student.
Yeah.
And one of my neurodivergent students said, oh, I like to line the peanut. I did peanut M&Ms this year for the first time. I like to line them up by most to least in terms of color. And then I eat most to least. And then I end up with the one that there's only, the least number. And I just sort of smiled and I said, I love your neurodivergent brain, because she's out as neurodivergent. And everybody's like, yeah. So even that, like, we could look at that and say to the outside observer, like, what is going on here? Because it's not like what most people do, but it's not hurting anybody. But it's also like this coping tool for overwhelm of too much food and too many flavors at one time, whether it's on your palate or you can't handle more than one texture at a time.
Yeah.
Isn't it amazing that a kid would figure out how to eat them one at a time so they can still eat them? That's coping, right?
Yeah.
That's just sort of like natural, their neurology working out a way for them to move through the world. And so we don't just look at the label of the neurodivergency, but also what are these patterns that we tend to see in folks in terms of how they cope. But yeah, it used to be, neurodivergent was like ADHD and autism. And then we're like, we see all these brain differences with folks that have complex trauma. And for those that don't know, complex trauma is when trauma starts really early in childhood. So it does actually form how your brain forms. And then we're like, learning disabilities, most of them, dyslexia, for example, being one of those. And I've just recently seen them folding in, and the ICD, the last iteration of the ICD does this, folding in tic disorder and Tourette's and some of these other ones, knowing that they really are neurologically based. So, and even OCD, it isn't that you're just not strong enough and you don't have enough willpower. It's that these are really driving neurological factors that you're unfairly asking someone to just drop. It's no easier than saying, cut your own arm off. It's that hard, right? So all these things that are under there, and it's why it's called a spectrum. But yeah, we've had a lot of people ask about our last video about soft signs of autism, right? So this word that we see showing up more now. And I really do think it's bearing out of this idea of people gathering on social media, places like TikTok, and sharing their lived experience. And then someone says, oh, I separate my food too. But those are not words you're going to find in DSM or ICD, or if you interview the majority of therapists who know nothing about neurodivergence, they're not going to say that person separates their food. And if you just said, oh, you have a new client coming to see you and they separate their food, they're going to blindly go, oh, that's compulsive and we need to extinguish that behavior. So there's all these things that I think it's wonderful that we're seeing that fall under there. I can't remember if I've shared with the audience or not, but I've recently absorbed and owned fully the label of being dyslexic. I've had a creator on TikTok who's a special ed person, and I'm like, I do that. And then I started researching dyslexia, and I always thought it was just transposing numbers or letters. Like that's one tiny little part of it. I'm like, oh my God, yeah, having trouble reading, it's painful to read, and eye tracking and all the other things that go into it. I'm like, oh, that is what dyslexia is. Yeah. And then we learn about folks that are hyperlexic in autism.
Yep.
And then I'm like, for a while, I was like, well, I wasn't hyperlexic. I had really avoided reading. I still avoid reading. Does it mean I fit? Oh, it's dyslexia. So even exploring your own journey and finding how you live these things, like even with you, like I have these nuggets of it. It's definitely under that neurodivergent umbrella as a neurodivergent, which I do think you could own that label, but it's not for me to put on you. It's for you to own if you decide, right? But that I love that it's the edges are getting softer, and leave it to the neurodivergent community, to the neurodiverse community to recognize the patterns, right? Oh yeah. I do that as I eat, or I have isms around how I eat, or I have isms around how we had a reader share on one of ours that if she's having trouble sleeping, she likes to sort things, like sort
beads, or like untangle yarn and that type of thing.
Which, by the way, are meditative practices. There are monks that do that as a form of meditation. And the first thing that came to my mind was it's like counting sheep.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. So how amazing that someone moves towards something like that to try to soothe themselves. I've always been a believer, and maybe it's part of my Adlerian education, that he defined behavior as it gets a little lost in translation, but he defined it as purposeful, meaning there's a reason people are doing what they're doing. Yeah. And it's, don't assume pathology. Even that could be, they're doing this because they're trying to cope, right? And so that, to me, counting beads and sorting yarn when you can't sleep is a brilliant way to try to figure out a way to soothe, right? And those are all nuggets of wonderful ways of coping that neurodivergents do.
Yeah. And you know what? I think, as the umbrella grows, right? The umbrella, we've moved from like, your portable pocket umbrella to like the big golf umbrella, like, come on under here, everybody, it's nice. Yeah. Okay. But where this idea of, again, we're really going to lean into, I think, neurodiversity, which is that neurological variance is normal and expected, right? Then yes, this is kind of an acceptance, an awareness and acceptance of the way someone works, right? Yeah. No judgment. So you don't want to pull your string cheese into strands and you just want to eat it. Great. But I think what's so interesting, and this is a more of a psychological piece, which is, how do people face and accept or understand difference from themselves? Yeah. And that's, again, that's not a neurodivergent or neurodiverse concept by any means. We've been struggling with this from all the isms, right?
Right.
Race, gender, sex. We've it all. And this idea of how do you face difference? How do you understand difference? How do you accommodate even and accept difference? And I think that for me has been a bigger thing, and that's why people are like, well, but I've got Tourette's and I have OCD. Can I come under the umbrella? And it's like, because you don't think, your brain doesn't work in the ways that the neuromajority expects.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
thank goodness for it, because the world would be
Yeah.
really boring. But, you know,
Right? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, this is where the creativity is. This is where the out of the box thinking comes from. And so
Yeah.
what if I don't want my food to touch? I'm like,
Yeah.
it's not, like you said, it's not hurting anybody.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. That's
let
good.
me do it, you know? And, you know, if you're around
Mhm.
people that are not, that might lovingly tease you and things, but totally accept you, that's great. But if you've got
Yeah.
people in your life that are like judging you hard
Yeah.
on some of these non-harmful things, like,
Yeah.
I don't know. I got some
And
ideas. Oh, sorry. I
yeah.
got some
Oh,
ideas. Yeah. Okay. Anyway.
yeah. So true. I mean, and why? Why is it making them uncomfortable? They'll say things like, well, then my child's going to go out in society and
Yeah.
people are going to judge them and look at them funny. And I would say, well, that could happen and people are cruel. I really have hope for the future with younger folks because they are
Yeah.
the ones that are getting it and saying, yes, everybody's different. And let's stop hurting each other by harping on the differences and being mean about it. It just is what it is, right?
Well, you know, Dana, and I think like your example brings up more about the parent than about the
Yeah.
child, right?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
idea of, you know, in psychology, we call this projective identification, but
Mhm. Mhm.
this idea, you know, I'll go back in a more to a more compassionate space and the very tender space of parenting, which
Mhm.
is as a parent, you bring your stuff to
Yeah.
the parenting dyad and interaction. And if you've got your own unmet needs,
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
it's going to be really hard for you to create that compassionate space for your child to be who
Right.
they're meant to be.
Right.
And it's not easy. This
Mm.
world, I'm really convinced the more that I do this work and the more that I support the wonderful people that I do, this world is really hard for them to be in.
I was just thinking that shout out to a couple of psychologists that I know in Rhode Island, and they're not on a lot of social media. I know they're on Facebook, and they're called Autism Level Up. Should check them out.
Oh, totally.
Um,
Autism Level Up's
yeah,
awesome.
they're
They're
awesome. Yeah, and
awesome.
so
They're
yeah,
so good.
they do a lot of stuff with kids, right? They're going into
Yep.
schools and teaching, and they
Yep.
had a post yesterday shouting out to a teacher, and you could see the teacher in the room, and then all the students were sort of gathered around the teacher on the floor. These were maybe like kindergarten age or first grade little kids, and one was on like a stationary bike, and one was on this other
Yeah.
thing, and they had their faces hidden, which makes me crazy when parents post like full videos of their kids online.
Oh,
They
yeah.
don't even hide their face. But they were like, this is full body learning. And it just struck, I'm going to get choked up even thinking about it. It's like, this is when you said the world is hard. It's the first thing I thought was like learning systems aren't geared for us. And here are two people that are trying so hard to teach people. And then this teacher saying, I'm going to go for it. I'm just going to let these kids move around and then see if they learn better, and they do. So it is hard out there because all these systems need to shift. They need to change. They need to change how they're looking at things. They need to
Yeah.
make whether it's accommodations or just change how learning happens. Right? Let's get
Yeah.
all those kids that need to move around to learn all in the same classroom because they'll be fine with each other. They're going to disrupt the other kids. Fine. Put all the quiet kids in another classroom and put all the ones that want to move around and learn in this classroom because they'll be fine with each other. And it's
Yeah.
so hard to create that version of change. So when I see people like those two doing it, it's like, this is so awesome. Right.
Yeah, they're great, and they
Yeah.
have some really great, like, just kind of free materials on their website that
Yeah.
they it's
Yeah.
like they're just
Yeah.
super they're just I we
Yeah.
need to, like, we should meet them. They
Yeah.
sound like really cool people.
Yeah.
But I will say, Dana, I think the other thing that I hear a lot is, but the real world just isn't like that, Gwen. You know, the real world, you're not allowed to ride your
Mhm.
bike while you're at work, da 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 da. And what I want to say to that
Want to
is
bet?
just,
Not,
yeah,
a lot of people
exactly.
do.
It's
Yeah.
like, listen, then yeah, maybe a desk job in the corporate world is not for them,
Yeah.
but there
Yeah.
are thousands of other options for
That's
that
right.
person. We
Yeah.
need to find where they belong in
That's
order
right.
for them to thrive. And
Yeah.
that's, you know, I'm kind of, I don't know. I mean, I don't mean for this to turn into a rant, but I'm kind of tired of like needing everyone to fit in the same environment. You
Mhm.
know,
Mhm.
it's like one environment isn't the best for everybody. And
Right.
and that's just not the case. Now, we've got a lot of people who experience that autism burnout, that autistic burnout,
Mhm.
because they've
Yeah.
masked to fit into that space.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's ugly. It is
Yeah.
gnarly and ugly. And helping someone come out of autistic burnout is
It's
awful.
really hard. Yeah.
It's
You don't
awful.
put someone who doesn't know how to swim in the deep end because they're gonna die, and that's, like, what autistic burnout
Uh,
is. You've continually thrown them in the pool, and they don't know how to swim. That's what we're
well, I
doing
mean,
to them.
yeah, and I talk about this in my practice. I always talk about habitats. It's like for whatever
Mhm.
reason we get like plants in their habitats and animals in their
Yeah.
habitats, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you're not
Yeah.
going to take that hibiscus flower from Hawaii and stick it in Alaska or the
Right.
Gobi Desert. Like you're just
Exactly.
not. You know it's going to die because
Yeah.
the conditions
Exactly.
aren't right for that particular
Yep. Yep.
plant, or that particular animal is not going to do well.
Yeah.
We're even more evolved that like we that applies to us as well. And I think
Yeah.
we just
Yeah.
kind of forget that. And so, at the end of the day, it's like, how do we promote more awareness and acceptance
Yeah.
of difference,
Yeah.
of
Yeah. And that's what I do think
difference.
younger folks are doing better.
Oh yeah.
Like, even when I was a kid, if you wore mismatched colors, like this morning, I was putting on this pink shirt under this blue sweater, and I'm like, "Can I do that?"
Yeah. Looks great,
Because it's
Jen.
those years of conditioning of like, "You shouldn't do that." There was a silly post I saw where people were wearing black shoes and brown socks, and it sounds ridiculous. Some of you are listening are like, "What the hell?" But that would have been a thing for me growing up. That would have been the source of bullying, and then that Dana doesn't know how to why do we do this to each other?
I know.
Right?
Just like leave it.
Oh my
Um,
god. Yeah.
by the way, no, I don't have ADHD, and here's my connection. Punky Brewster. Do you remember Punky Brewster?
I didn't watch it, but I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
I mean, now that you're saying like, mix match colors and things like
Yeah.
this, I
Yeah.
remember when Punky Brewster came onto the television. I was like, what?
All those
Because
colors.
she wore mismatched colors, and it was
Totally.
just like her, and it was like just her quirkiness or
Yep.
whatever it
Yep.
was,
Yep.
and here are some early differences. I think this is why I personally love things like Star Trek or
Yeah.
Orville, or it's like diversity is represented in
Yeah.
these really different kind of ways,
Yeah.
where we can explore stories and
Yeah.
relationships and difference and acceptance and how
Yeah.
we close the gap on some of this stuff anyway. But
Yeah. Yeah.
um
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think
yeah,
sort of culture is catching up with that. And we see it in
yeah,
media and those kinds of things, I think,
yeah,
which is wonderful because it's
yeah.
about bloody time. Yeah. Yeah. So we
And
we
on that
started
note,
this out.
that's
We
about
started
bloody
this
time.
out like, what is neurodiversity? I think, yeah, obviously we talk about this all the time. We talked about the definition of it, I think, when we first started airing these
Yeah,
podcasts. And
yeah,
I think it's, we're at like 75-ish that we posted last week. And to revisit the idea, it's even shifted in the amount of time that we've been doing this, which is all good. I think it's all
all
good.
good,
The more
all
people that
good.
get it and understand it, the better. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and stay open-minded and stay flexible. And then if we're really going to
Mhm.
be experiential and context dependent, we do
Mhm.
actually need to pay attention to what our contexts and environments are today.
That's right.
That
Exactly.
is
Yeah.
that is that
Yeah.
makes the most sense.
Yeah.
Oh, I
Exactly.
was going to say something, but I won't be divisive. All right. I'll talk to you later.
Can't do that. You can't do that.
Oh, that just keeps them coming back for more, Dina.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
no,
That's yeah. Don't you hate those shows that while we're on that, those shows where they're reality shows and then they're like, the winner is,
Oh, yeah.
and then they always go to a commercial. I won't even watch those shows anymore. I get so pissed. I'm like, you're manipulating me. Screw you. See, I almost made you do a bleep,
You're
but yeah.
so good. But Dana, I'm really good at censoring now.
Okay.
It's very easy for me to censor. I
Okay.
mean, if there's a day where you just need to let it fly, let it fly. Like
Okay.
I'm so confident in censoring now. Like you have helped me learn a new skill, and I am
That's
deeply
great.
grateful for it.
Oh, great. Well, there you go. Yeah.
Okay. Oh man, I really need to go. Wow, don't call Dana to the mat. By the way, that's the lesson. Don't call Dana to the mat.
Oh,
On that
God, this is
note,
great.
on that
All
note, be good
right.
to you, everyone.
Be good to you and go out there and swear because it's good for you. Their research is showing smarter people swear, and it's a great
Yeah.
release. Yeah,
Yo, no, like
Oh.
people who use the F word have higher intelligences. I think
yeah,
I read that somewhere.
There you go.
Feel
Yeah.
free to fact check me. It's
I like
good.
that one. Yeah,
All
it's
right.
good.
All right.
All
Bye,
right. Bye,
everyone.
everybody.